Hello and welcome. It's Frances here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There is a subscribe button below if you would like to help support this channel by subscribing. Also a bell to be notified as to when I upload more content. I'm coming to you from Ghana country, and as such, I acknowledge the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of the land upon which I reside. So this video is somewhat controversial. I'm wanting to upload it this weekend because here in Australia it is actually Australia Day, and that has an increasing amount of controversy around it due to how this country was settled by the British, the colonialists, back in 17 something or 18 something. I'm actually not born of this land, and I don't know, maybe I should not have my dates in front of me, but yeah, there's a lot of controversy as to, and it's flown on from the original sort of taking up by the British, and also how the Indigenous peoples, the Aboriginals, were treated and actually still are today. So some people may call it Australia Day. It's a chance to sort of celebrate. Or if you're on the other side of the fence, it's also known as Invasion Day. And there's a push to change the date, which these days with sort of an increase in white supremacy, the white sort of, yes, I think we know what I'm talking about. That's sort of had a backlash. There's a increase now to sort of reclaim the date and keep it as it is, Australia Day. Yep, I'm not going to go into that further because this video is sort of going to touch a little bit on that, but there's other things that I want to sort of put out there. And what inspired this video in particular is, well, a couple of comments that a fellow author made in relation to their trip around the world, which included what appeared to be a very or extremely brief time visit to Australia, and in particular a trip out to Uluru in the centre of the country, which used to be called Ayers Rock, but now it's called Uluru, which is the traditional name for our monolith. And really some of the comments that Luke made based on their observances of the Aboriginal peoples in particular, that I thought I might give a little bit more context to. And the reason for this is that I've listened to these comments he's made a few times, and I kept feeling, and it could be my interpretation, so I'm not having any criticism from Luke or about Luke. To me, they were maybe have been made through an sort of European-centric lens. And again, as I said, this could actually just be my interpretation of the choice of words that were used that didn't quite sit with me all that well. And I will link the video below and also make some note of because it's quite a long video because he did quite a fantastic world trip. But in particular, I'll sort of timestamp or whatever it is where he made these comments. Now, for the record, I'm not an anthropologist or historian or an archaeologist or any kind of expert. I'm not even a native-born Australian. I have been living here in this country for some 24 years, and I do have a piece of paper telling me that I'm Australian, but yeah, so as I said, this isn't intended to be criticism. It's just sort of like, especially in light of this weekend being Australia Day too, it's this same or similar rhetoric or perception, whether Luke was aware of it or not. And for the record, as I said, I just thought I would provide a little bit more maybe context of some of these comments that he made. And also, I'm currently, because I was very fortunate. I went to Uluru for New Year's and I picked up this book, Deep Time Dreaming, Uncovering Ancient Australia by Billy Griffiths. It's won a number of awards, been out for a number of years now. And it's about archaeological digs. And yeah, you see it when I read, I sort of put tags in here. And it's actually quite interesting because it sort of also enhances what I sort of want to share with you, especially when it comes to Australia and the uniqueness of Australia and the uniqueness of the Aboriginal peoples and the uniqueness of the country, its landscape, its environment, the whole kit and caboodle. And I raise this because Luke made a comment at, I think, around about 14 minutes in, 14.33 minutes in, about the Aboriginal culture being a unique sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And he compared that to cave people, or to what cave people did, say, in Europe. And he did acknowledge that this probably was due to Australia being so isolated for thousands upon thousands of years. Then he went on and sort of made a comment, and again, this is my interpretation, that there were no agricultural techniques developed by the Australian Aborigines, and due to any apparent lack of pottery items where wood was used in a lot of the artifacts, this allegedly has been interpreted, I don't know whether by Luke himself or by people he's had discussions with, or by other people, as our Aboriginal peoples having a more simplistic lifestyle, even when compared to other Indigenous peoples or cultures all around the world, also indicating that they were sort of lacking a level of sophistication or sophisticated development. In other countries who are sort of more sophisticated and more developed than the Aborigines peoples were. And I said these comments, I said probably based on his interpretation, what he saw, but because these are sort of rhetorics that even Billy Griffiths mentions in his book, through the archaeological digs, revealing a lot more of sort of the backstory of the Aboriginal peoples than what, can I say, even today other people want to, or situations, areas of our community actually want to acknowledge. So I think it's quite important to address these, can we say, errors in judgment, or when we compare one culture through the lens of another, and in this instance it's through a Western lens where the advancements are based on, so what advancements happened in Europe. So I will put the links to the sources that I found. The first one came from the Australian Geographic webpage, and it mentioned 10 enduring innovations of the Aboriginal peoples, starting off with the boomerang. Yes, it's made from wood, from munga wood in particular, so it's a particular type of wood. And while other cultures also invented throwing sticks with a controllable sort of motion and spin, the boomerang itself, with its sort of angled shape and asymmetrical curves, actually utilizes one of the more complex principles of aerodynamics, this asymmetrical lift. So, and as we know, the boomerang is an Australian Aboriginal invention, and they also invented a number of boomerangs depending on what they were using them for as well. Also, another sort of wood implement is the woomera, which is actually a shaped piece of hardwood with a stone attached to it at the base, used for leverage, and this enabled them to throw a spear some 3 times further than just manually doing it. And woomeras have been sort of tested and proven that they could be thrown with such force that they could skewer the trunk of a fully grown eucalyptus tree, which is actually a very hard wood. Then they also made a sort of thermoplastic resin from Pacific grasses, including the grass trees, that once this was sort of cooled, this resin was strong enough to bind rock to wood, and was also used in creating their spears, their woomeras, and their axes. And I'll come back to axes in a moment. Then we also have the didgeridoo, in itself a very iconic symbol or instrument traditionally played by men in ceremony. It's believed to be the oldest wood or wind instrument in the world. And though it's deceptively simple in design, it's actually, according to this webpage, a very complex and complicated instrument. Now, Luke's observance that there was no pottery or everything was made out of wood is not actually correct. It may be in the center, but I'm looking at Australia as a whole. The Aboriginal peoples, like other peoples, did definitely make stone tools. And these, again, were highly sophisticated in their range and also their uses. Some of these tools were even made by natural glass that was fashioned into chisels, saws, knives, spearheads, used for hunting, for carrying food, for also making ochre and also nets, clothing, baskets. It's also believed that the Aboriginal people were thought to be one of the first ancient peoples, because Australian Aborigines are between 60, 70 years, 70,000 years continuously living in Australia. And that makes them the oldest sort of continuously living group of peoples in the world. So they were one of the first who were believed to use these stone tools to grind seeds, and also the first to create round edges on the stone tools, and they could actually grind a precisioned edge from stone that was so sharp or equal in its sharpness to any metal blade in England in 1788, which is when the first English people set foot on this continent. They also developed an assortment of wares and elaborate sort of stone fish traps. So they were highly sophisticated in understanding engineering, physics, agriculture. And again, some of these fish traps are believed to be up to 40,000 years old. And there's evidence of fish farms, and these are, again, in various other parts of Australia, that have been created by using a complex system of channels, linked weirs, ponds, all out of river stone. And then, of course, we have what's called fire stick farming or controlled burning, which these days more sort of parks are beginning to take on Indigenous rangers to help do this sort of controlled burning. But the Aborigines invented this, and in this controlled burning, it would actually direct the fires in specific directions to help clear tracks through the bush, to open parklands, also flushing out animals that they would kill for food, and then the new grasses would grow back after the area had been burnt. And this is a very unique attribute to this country, is that a lot of the Indigenous plants need to have the fire in order for the seeds to germinate. They also made water bags that acted like fridges out of wallaby skin. So they were familiar with sort of principles of heat transfer in order to keep water or food cool. And then there's the very knowledgeable on bush tucker or bush foods and medicines, and the kit and caboodle. And they also made children's toys like rattles and dolls and spinning tops for their children to play with. So coming back to what Luke was saying about pottery, that in his opinion, they weren't as advanced because there's no pottery. Well, that's not correct, because some, I think 82 pieces of pottery were discovered off Queensland. It's Lizard Island. I'm not sure how to pronounce the word in like Aboriginal wording. I think it's Jiggerera. And these pieces of pottery are believed to date back between 3,000 and 1,000 years old. So they did go through a pottery making period as well. So coming back to this agriculture comment as well, because that was the first thing that sort of irked me a little bit, is that, well, the center of the desert where Uluru is, it's evident that there's nothing you can farm out there, and it's all desert. It's all sort of like just a few trees. Animals there are very migratory as well, and if Luke's actually perceiving agriculture as being, say, the domestication of cows and sheep and goats and the like that, these animals actually were not native to Australia, actually weren't part of the Australian landscape until colonialisation. But what the Aboriginal peoples did do, they did grow crops. They grew yams and they grew various types of grain like natural mullet. They also farmed macadamia nuts, fruits and berries. As I mentioned earlier, they also trapped fish. There is also evidence that they actually reared dingoes, which is our wild dogs here, possums and emus and cassowaries. There's also evidence, depending on what country or group of peoples, that they moved caterpillars from one area to a new breeding area. They also carried fish stock across the country. There's other evidence of Aboriginal farming practices that today we will sort of label as agroforestry, so the combination of agriculture and forestry. They were also known to do crop rotation, also to inter or mix cropping. So there are a lot of, or increasingly more evidence coming to light of the various types of farming. And again, this is this European lens that I think we get tripped up on when we're looking at other countries or cultures themselves. And I think it's also, especially when it comes to Australia, because it is a very unique country, it's important to keep in mind that it's the same size as the US. And it stretches from, I think, from the top of UK down to Africa and also the width of Europe. And this means that it's extremely diverse. And so too were the Indigenous peoples, and they still are today. And they have been, as I said, continuously living on this continent for at least 60, I think the average is 65,000 years. I think it's also important to just keep in mind that the landmass that we call Australia today was once part of a larger landmass, Guanaland, which also included Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, and Madagascar. And this itself broke off from Pangaea, a supercontinent, some 200 million years ago. And Guanaland sort of broke off around about 135 million years ago. And then Australia and Antarctica sort of eventually separated. And really, so Australia's been quite separated really for the last 35 million years ago. And that's where it's been completely independent and of an island. And what's interesting is due to the shift in the tectonic plates, tectonic plates, get my words right, Australia's drifting, and it drifts about a rate of, I think, 7 centimeters a year, and is actually part of the world's or the planet's largest moving tectonic plate. And scientists believe that probably in another 20 or 30 million years, Australia is likely going to sideswipe East Asia. But due to Australia's isolation, this is why we've got such a unique environment. Also, such diverse, and so many different deserts in all our deserts. I think 7 deserts, and every single desert is different. And this uniqueness has been like an integral role in how the Aboriginal peoples developed agricultural practices. And these may not be, as I said, recognized through a European lens or a Eurocentric lens. I think another important point is the 65,000 years that the Aboriginal peoples have been living on this country predates any kind of modern human settlement in Europe and in the Americas. How long, according to the Aboriginal stories or the people themselves, they've been living here, their dream stories, the dreamtime tales of stories that they've been here since the land was created. And this is their dreaming stories, which is a system of belief that's held by the first peoples, and an account of their origins. And these dreaming stories contain very powerful beings that roam the landscape and also lay sort of moral and physical groundworks for human society as well. And before the dreaming, there's also the belief that there was a land before time when the whole earth was flat. And these ancestral beings molded the landscape through their actions, giving birth to the first peoples, to their culture. And it's really hard to say as to how old dreaming is. So it existed from the beginning of time. But what is interesting, and Billy Griffiths mentions it in this book, is that in 1968, a geologist by the name of Jim Bowler discovered human remains around a now dry lake known as Mungo in southwest New South Wales. And these human remains were sort of like buried in a very ceremonial way. And they discovered that it was female, so they've called her Mungo Lady. And she has been dated, her remains have been dated of being some 40,000 to 42,000 years old. So these are the oldest human remains so far discovered, found anywhere in Australia. And also one of the earliest astronomically modern human remains that have been discovered anywhere in the world. Okay, that's a little bit of context to that. Another comment that Luke made, I think around about 16 minutes in or something, in relation to that, more effort should be made to help preserve the Aboriginal way of life, because clearly it's not compatible with Western modern lifestyle that has been thrust upon them. And that's something I definitely agree with. And I think it's the same right across the board with many Indigenous peoples. I think even some of us Westerners, we've had the sort of lifestyle sort of dictated to us for so long, we are used to it, or whether we like it or not. But when it comes to the Indigenous people, especially through colonization, we need to sort of keep in mind that colonization has only been around for 250, 300 years. Well, we've had it basically from time immemorial. So, yes, I think it's very important, especially here in Australia, because I can't speak for other countries. This should be sort of addressed. It's actually, in my opinion, it's going to be very controversial, part of Australia's shame. And also this continual refusal of acknowledging the harm, the trauma, and I guess let's be honest here, if you look at the history of colonialization here and what happened, it's basically an attempted genocide of the Aboriginal peoples since Britain established its colony in 1788. And to me, and this is my uneducated opinion, what seems to also be underpinning this is the unspoken memory of Australia being terra nullius. And that's a legal principle that was implemented into Australian law on the basis of the British settlement in 1835 by the proclamation of the New South Wales Governor, Richard Bourke. This is some 47 years after the arrival of the First Fleet. And it links back to Captain James Cook, who claimed possession of the eastern coast of Australia for Britain in 1770. And that was done under the doctrine of terra nullius, basically meaning that the land was uninhabited. And of course, that assumption is or was grossly incorrect, but it sort of has been, I think it's sort of, we've got this conscious memory of that or subconscious memory of that, especially in white Australian culture. However, at that time, when Captain Cook said there's no one here, it is believed that there was between 300,000 to maybe even up to 1 million Aboriginal peoples, comprising of some 600 tribes or nations or countries, speaking some 250 languages with various dialects, and in a very short period of time. So that is around the First Fleet came in 1707, as James Cook. So the British settlement was 1835. So by 1901, the 300,000 to 1 million Aboriginal peoples, their population had fallen to just over 90,000 people, largely due to disease, frontier violence, and also disruption of their traditional society due to the land grab that happened on. And again, this is part of Australia's shame, or white Australia's shame. It hasn't actually stopped then. In the 20th century, many Aboriginal peoples were confined to reserves or missions or institutions. Government regulations controlled most aspects of their lives. Added to that, thousands of Indigenous people, children, especially those of mixed heritage, were also removed from their families. And then we have the stolen generation, and this continued up, and I think the stolen generation still happened into the 60s. It wasn't until the late 60s that and this is 1960, that we're looking at, say, 60 years ago, or nearly 60 years ago, 50 years ago, still within one generation. The Aboriginals were only, I think it was 1968 or 69 were given the right to vote or were recognised as Australians on their own land. So as I said, this weekend, it's Australia Day, public holiday on the 26th. It is synonymous of clothing with the Australian flag and accessories. A lot of this made in China, of all places, not here in Australia. And it's also where thousands of people become Australian citizens and citizen ceremonies across the country. When I got my citizenship, I didn't want to be part of these ceremonies. So I just dropped my piece of paper and walked away. It's regarded as a day of acknowledging this country's history. Although there is a push, especially from Indigenous peoples, for a truth teller. As I said, it's very controversial. The 26th of January has not always been perceived as Australia Day. And I'll do a few links below as to other dates it has been and also the associations to it. So this is getting a little bit too long-winded. I don't know if it's made any sense. I've sort of jumped down another rabbit hole. But yes, I think in the 21st century, I still think it's extremely shameful of this country how they treat the Indigenous peoples. And I said there's this underlying attitude across a large, can I say a large proportion of white Australian society. I've done, sometimes I work on the enrollment centres when it comes to the elections, and I also was there last year for the referendum. It was very interesting. It was a referendum to acknowledge our Indigenous peoples who have been on this land for some 60 to 65,000 years continuously. So they could have a say in particular laws or that would basically affect them like the land and sort of like give an input. It turned into a bit of a political shit fight, shall I say. It was hijacked. I don't know if our current government sort of presented it incorrectly, but they definitely weren't sort of like defending it when the opposition and we have a very sort of controlled media got on board. They didn't explain. I think they maybe rushed it through a little bit more. It's ironic considering, from my understanding, and again, I could be wrong, it was like an advisory council. That was what the goal was, but it needed to have the constitution changed, and because everybody got very precious about that. We have other advisory councils. Our government has, in more recent times, given a nice advisory councils to the Jewish community. We also have mining advisory councils, a lot of magnates and mine magnates and influential people can influence policy and laws like other places around the world, I guess, in the Western democracy. It's a bit of a joke. But everybody was getting really sort of like precious over Aboriginal peoples having a say. Yeah. So I'm just going to leave it there. I said it is a very complicated, very messy subject, and I'm definitely not qualified to speak more than what I have. I am finding this book really interesting because it shows the clash in cultures, especially the archaeologists when they are finding human remains, and also within their Aboriginal peoples themselves, as to sort of wanting to sort of, they've got this evidence proving that how long they've been here. But I guess too, it's like if someone was excavating in our local cemetery where our ancestors are buried, how would we feel? Then having those remains, those bones of our deceased loved ones paraded around the world. When it comes to cultural sensitivity as well. Yeah, so there's the Aboriginal peoples with their spirituality and their connection with their ancestors, because again, this goes into something that maybe from a European-centric lens, we do not properly understand, because we have been so separated from the land. Even our religious structures are not earthed in the land. But yet the Indigenous peoples, and again, I'm assuming that this is similar, could be similar to other Indigenous peoples, but the Aboriginal peoples here, their ancestors, these rites and ceremonies, and as I said, the white invasion or colonization is in recent memory. So I also do not think it's too much to ask for a little bit of sensitivity. I'll say that too, because we've got in recent times, I think it was even last year, a new subdivision being built, or has been built, and they actually discovered that it was on part of a graveyard, an Aboriginal burial site. I don't know what the outcome of it, but from what I heard, it didn't stop the development, which I thought was a little bit disappointing, or very disappointing. It's sort of like, and this is something that Billy Griffiths mentions in his book, for Australia to completely get on board, it's got to be more than the lip service. And I honestly think it's like, we've got this really unique living culture. Why aren't we embracing it? Why is there a fear? In every succeeded government, they will take one step forward and then they'll retreat from it, and then they'll backpedal and they'll palm it off. And yeah, I don't know what the results for. I just wish Australia would take a good hard look at itself at times. And then in this modern age, we've got this rise of, yeah, can I say white supremacy? It's a bit of fascism. It's a little bit daunting, scary. Well, I'm going to leave that here. I hope, I don't know if Luke will watch this, but Luke, I hope that sort of like gave you a little bit more context to the observances that you may have made. Yeah. So if you are in Australia and you're celebrating this long weekend, do so, but just be mindful that not everybody, especially our Indigenous peoples, may feel that they have something to celebrate. Blessings.